The restaurant on Gorky Street gleamed under the lights of central Moscow in 1965, its chandeliers visible through tall windows, white tablecloths arranged in perfect rows, waiters in pressed uniforms standing at attention near the entrance. To the average Soviet citizen walking past on their way home from work, this establishment might as well have been on another planet. The question of why ordinary Soviet people rarely, if ever, entered such places reveals not just a quirk of socialist economics, but a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Soviet project itself, a tension between revolutionary ideology and the stubborn persistence of hierarchy that no amount of Marxist-Leninist theory could resolve. When the Bolsheviks seized power in October 1917, they inherited not just a collapsing empire, but an entire social infrastructure built around class distinction. The restaurants of pre-revolutionary Russia had been spaces of conspicuous consumption, where merchants, nobles, and the emerging bourgeoisie displayed their wealth through elaborate meals that could cost more than a factory worker earned in a month. The famous Yar restaurant in Moscow, where Rasputin himself had caroused, or the elegant establishments along Nevsky Prospect in Petrograd represented everything the revolution claimed to oppose. In the early years of Soviet power, many of these establishments were simply shuttered, their owners fled or arrested, their dining rooms converted to other purposes, or left to decay in the chaos of civil war. The period of war communism from 1918 to 1921 made the entire question of restaurants almost absurd. The Soviet state had nationalized food distribution, attempting to eliminate money itself and replace market relations with direct allocation of resources. Private trade was banned, and the concept of dining out for pleasure became not just impractical, but ideologically suspect. People stood in lines for bread rations when bread was available at all. The famine that gripped the Volga region in 1921 killed an estimated 5 million people. In this context, the idea of a restaurant serving multiple courses to paying customers seemed like a relic of a dead world. The new economic policy introduced by Lenin in 1921 represented a tactical retreat from pure socialism, a recognition that the Soviet economy needed elements of market relations to survive. Private restaurants reopened during this period, along with shops, cafes, and small businesses. For a brief window from 1921 to 1928, Soviet cities experienced a strange hybrid economy, where state-owned enterprises competed with private entrepreneurs, where you could find both workers' canteens serving subsidized meals and private establishments catering to the new Soviet elite and the remnants of the old commercial class. But even during NEP, restaurants remained largely outside the experience of ordinary workers and peasants. Prices were set by market forces, and market forces meant that those with money ate well, while those without made do with whatever they could afford. When Stalin consolidated power and launched the first five-year plan in 1928, the brief experiment with market socialism ended abruptly. Private restaurants were closed, their owners arrested as class enemies or speculators. The entire food service industry was brought under state control and reorganized according to the principles of socialist planning. The distinction that emerged in the early 1930s would define Soviet dining for the next 6 decades. On one side stood the stolovaya, the public canteen, and on the other stood the restaurant, and these two institutions served fundamentally different purposes within the Soviet system. The stolovaya was where ordinary Soviet people ate when they ate outside their homes. Every factory had one, every office building, every institute and university. These were utilitarian spaces with long tables, simple chairs, and serving lines where workers received standardized meals at heavily subsidized prices. The food was basic, the portions calculated by nutritionists to provide adequate calories for labor, the atmosphere purely functional. A meal at a factory canteen in 1935 might consist of cabbage soup, a portion of kasha, a piece of bread, and weak tea, all for a price that represented perhaps 2 or 3% of a worker's daily wage. The Stolovaya embodied the socialist principle of providing for basic needs, ensuring that every worker could eat regardless of their individual circumstances. The restaurant, by contrast, occupied an ambiguous space in Soviet ideology from the moment of its reemergence under state ownership. The official justification for restaurants in a socialist society was that they served specific functional purposes. They provided meals for travelers far from home. They offered venues for official receptions and meetings with foreign delegations. They gave Soviet citizens a place to celebrate special occasions like weddings or anniversaries. But the reality of how restaurants operated revealed the gap between socialist theory and Soviet practice. The pricing structure of Soviet restaurants made them effectively inaccessible to ordinary workers. In 1960, when the average monthly wage in the Soviet Union was approximately 90 rubles, a meal for two at a decent Moscow restaurant could easily cost 30 to 40 rubles, perhaps more if alcohol was involved. The famous Praga restaurant on Arbat Street or the National Hotel restaurant near the Kremlin charged prices that would consume a week's wages for a typical factory worker. Even less prestigious establishments in smaller cities maintained price points that put them out of reach for regular dining by anyone earning an average salary. This pricing was not accidental, but reflected deliberate policy decisions about resource allocation and social control. The Soviet planning apparatus operated under constant scarcity, a condition not of absolute shortage, but of the systematic mismatch between production and demand that characterized command economies. Restaurants required ingredients that were often in limited supply: quality cuts of meat, fresh vegetables outside their growing season, imported items like coffee or lemons, alcohol beyond the basic vodka available in state stores. By setting restaurant prices high, the state rationed access to these scarce goods without having to explicitly admit that scarcity existed. The restaurant system also served as a mechanism for managing the Soviet elite, a way of providing privileges to party officials, factory directors, military officers, and members of the technical intelligentsia without appearing to violate egalitarian principles. Many restaurants operated on a two-tier system that was never officially acknowledged, but universally understood. Certain establishments had special rooms or sections that were accessible only with the right connections or the right paperwork. A party official could call ahead and secure a table, receive attentive service, and access menu items that were never available to walk-in customers. Foreign observers noted this phenomenon repeatedly throughout the Soviet period, describing how a restaurant that claimed to be fully booked would suddenly find space for someone who arrived with the proper introduction. The propiska system, which controlled where Soviet citizens could legally reside, intersected with restaurant access in ways that reinforced geographic hierarchies. Moscow and Leningrad had restaurants that residents of provincial cities could only dream about, establishments that served food simply unavailable in smaller towns. A worker from Sverdlovsk visiting Moscow on business might walk past the Metropole Hotel restaurant and see through its windows a world of white tablecloths and suited diners that had nothing to do with his own life. Even though both he and those diners were supposedly equal citizens of the same socialist state. The experience of actually trying to dine at a Soviet restaurant, for those who could afford it, often proved frustrating enough to discourage repeat attempts. The service culture that developed in Soviet food service was notorious for its indifference bordering on hostility. Waiters had no incentive to provide good service, Because their wages were fixed regardless of customer satisfaction, tips were officially discouraged as capitalist corruption, though they were sometimes expected anyway. And the power dynamic was inverted from capitalist restaurants because customers needed servers more than servers needed customers. Stories circulated endlessly about waiters who ignored patrons for hours, who claimed that half the menu was unavailable, who treated diners with open contempt unless properly bribed or connected. This service problem reflected a deeper issue in Soviet economics: the absence of meaningful feedback mechanisms between consumers and producers. In a market economy, a restaurant with terrible service loses customers and eventually closes or improves. In the Soviet system, restaurants received their funding from the state based on planned allocations, not on customer satisfaction. A restaurant that served awful food to miserable customers still met its production targets as long as it served the planned number of meals. The disconnect between the formal goals of the system and the actual incentives facing individual workers produced the characteristic Soviet experience of surly service and indifferent quality. The alcohol situation in Soviet restaurants deserves particular attention because it reveals how restaurants functioned as sites of social control and revenue extraction. Vodka was widely available and relatively cheap in state stores, but restaurants marked up alcohol prices dramatically, often making more profit from drinks than from food. The combination of high alcohol prices and the social expectation that celebrations involved heavy drinking meant that a wedding dinner or birthday party at a restaurant could cost a family several months of savings. Yet these occasions were precisely when ordinary Soviet people were most likely to use restaurants, creating a pattern where restaurants were associated with both celebration and financial strain, special occasions that required extraordinary expenditure. The geographic distribution of restaurants reinforced the centralization of Soviet power and privilege. Moscow in 1970 had approximately 1,000 restaurants and cafes for a population of 7 million, a ratio that seems reasonable until you consider that most of these establishments were concentrated in the city center and that many were effectively closed to ordinary Muscovites. Meanwhile, a provincial city of 100,000 people might have 3 or 4 restaurants, all serving similar mediocre food at prices that local workers could rarely afford. The collective farm worker in rural Russia or Ukraine might live their entire life without ever entering a restaurant, eating at home or in the farm canteen. The very existence of establishments where one paid to be served elaborate meals and abstraction from another world. The contrast with Eastern European socialist states illuminates how much of the Soviet restaurant situation reflected specific Soviet choices rather than inevitable features of socialism. In Hungary, after the reforms of 1968, restaurants operated with much greater autonomy, could source ingredients more flexibly, and developed a service culture that, while not matching Western standards, was noticeably better than the Soviet equivalent. Polish restaurants, even under martial law in the 1980s, maintained traditions of hospitality that made dining out a more accessible and pleasant experience than in the USSR. East Germany's Interhotels, though primarily serving Western visitors for hard currency, demonstrated that socialist enterprises could operate high-quality food service when properly incentivized. The rise of cooperative restaurants in the late 1980s under Gorbachev's perestroika reforms revealed the pent-up demand for dining options that had existed throughout the Soviet period. When regulations were loosened to allow semi-private food service establishments, cooperatives opened rapidly in major cities, offering better food and service than state restaurants, though often at even higher prices. The fact that these cooperatives found customers despite their cost demonstrated that the issue had never been a lack of Soviet people wanting to eat at restaurants, but rather the combination of pricing, quality, and availability that made state restaurants unappealing and inaccessible. The foreign currency restaurants that operated in major Soviet cities from the 1960s onward created a parallel dining world that ordinary Soviet citizens could observe but not enter. Establishments like the Berezka restaurants accepted only hard currency, serving food of a quality and variety unavailable in regular Soviet restaurants, catering to foreign tourists, diplomats, and the small number of Soviet citizens who had legal access to foreign money. These restaurants were not merely better than their ruble-only counterparts, they were qualitatively different, offering fresh ingredients, attentive service, and menus that changed based on availability rather than rigid planning. The existence of these establishments, visible but forbidden to ordinary Soviet people, embodied the contradictions of late socialism more vividly than any propaganda poster. The question of why Soviet people did not go to restaurants thus reveals itself to be not really a question about individual choice, but about systemic design. The Soviet restaurant system was structured, from its pricing to its supply chains to its service culture, in ways that made it simultaneously unnecessary for ordinary people who had access to subsidized canteens and inaccessible for those same people when they might have wanted to use restaurants for celebration or variety. The system maintained restaurants primarily to serve the elite, to extract revenue from special occasions, and to present a facade of socialist abundance to foreign visitors, not to provide a genuine service to the working class in whose name the revolution had been made. The statistics tell the story in numbers that official Soviet sources rarely emphasized. In 1985, near the end of the Soviet period, the USSR had approximately 70,000 restaurants and cafes for a population of 280 million people, a ratio of one establishment per 4,000 people. By comparison, the United States in the same year had approximately 400,000 restaurants for 240 million people, roughly 1 per 600 people. But even these numbers obscure the real disparity because they treat all restaurants as equivalent when Soviet restaurants were, on average, much larger and served far fewer meals per capita than their Western counterparts. The typical Soviet citizen ate at a restaurant perhaps once or twice a year, usually for a wedding or major celebration, while eating at workplace or school canteens was a daily occurrence. The legacy of the Soviet restaurant system persists in post-Soviet dining culture in ways both obvious and subtle. The explosion of restaurants in Russian cities after 1991 represented not just the arrival of capitalism, but the unleashing of demand that had been suppressed for 70 years. The emphasis on elaborate decor and formal service in many post-Soviet restaurants reflects both a reaction against Soviet austerity and a continuation of the Soviet-era association between restaurants and special occasions, rather than casual dining. The lingering expectation in some establishments that customers should be grateful for service rather than service providers being attentive to customers echoes the inverted power dynamics of Soviet food service. Understanding why Soviet people did not go to restaurants requires understanding the fundamental tension between the egalitarian rhetoric of Soviet socialism and the hierarchical reality of Soviet society. Restaurants were one of many mechanisms through which the Soviet system maintained and obscured class distinctions that officially did not exist, providing the elite with access to goods and experiences unavailable to ordinary workers while maintaining the fiction of a classless society. The high prices, poor service, and limited availability were not bugs in the system, but features, ways of rationing scarce resources and managing privilege without explicitly acknowledging the inequality that permeated Soviet life. The restaurant, that space of white tablecloths and chandeliers visible through windows on Gorky Street, stood as a monument to the gap between socialist theory and Soviet practice, a daily reminder that some citizens were more equal than others, no matter what the Constitution claimed.